Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're listening to this, you probably wanted to know more about how Bitcoin is doing in Europe.
Especially in Switzerland.
Right. And what it's like for a company like Relay who's working in that space.
Yeah.
Well, we've got a really great interview for you today.
Yeah, we talked to a Bitcoin expert at Relay.
Who's been involved with Bitcoin pretty much since the beginning.
And they've got some great stories about those early days. So let's jump right in.
One of the things that really stood out was how this expert first got involved with Bitcoin. Back in 2011, they actually used Bitcoin to buy a plane ticket.
For a protest.
Yeah, they needed a way to pay that was totally anonymous.
Wow. So even back then, people were finding really creative ways to use Bitcoin.
It shows how, even in those early days, people were drawn to Bitcoin because it offered something that traditional systems just couldn't match.
Privacy and security.
Exactly.
So fast forward to today, how does this expert define Bitcoin now?
Well, for them, Bitcoin is all about self-sovereignty. It's about giving individuals control over their own finances.
It's something that a lot of people are looking for these days.
Definitely. And that desire for more financial control is a big part of what drives Relay.
So can you tell us a little bit about Relay?
Relay is a Bitcoin-only savings app based in Switzerland.
And they call themselves the world's easiest Bitcoin savings app, right?
Yeah, that's their slogan.
Okay, so tell me more about that. Like, who can actually use Relay?
Right now, it's available for Swiss and Italian residents.
With plans to expand across the EU.
Yeah, they're working on that.
I know a lot of listeners are interested in learning more about Bitcoin, but it can be overwhelming.
Yeah, for sure.
And they want a hassle-free way to get started. Does Relay take that into account?
Well, Relay actually prioritizes security and ease of use through something called a self-custody model, but we'll get into that a bit more later.
Okay, sounds good. But first, I'm really curious about this Bitcoin-only approach. Why would a company focus solely on Bitcoin in this day and age?
Well, it's a strategic decision for them.
Done.
Their strong belief in Bitcoin's unique value and potential.
Yes. They see Bitcoin as this foundational technology, kind of like gold.
Ah, so they're focusing all their energy on one really valuable asset.
Yeah, exactly. And they really believe in focusing their expertise on just Bitcoin.
It seems like that focus is paying off, right?
Definitely. They were actually just awarded Best Crypto Startup in 2024.
Pretty impressive. And on top of that, they recently secured $12 million in Series A funding.
With a valuation of $72 million. So yeah, it's a good sign.
It shows serious commitment from investors who clearly see Relay as a major player in the Bitcoin space.
It'll be interesting to see what they do next.
Okay, so we talked about their focus on Bitcoin, but what about their marketing? How did they get the word out?
You know, what's interesting is that they're not relying on the typical hype you see with a lot of crypto companies.
So what are they doing differently?
They call themselves a content machine, and they're really focused on education.
That makes sense. People are looking for reliable information, not just hype.
Exactly, and Relay is trying to provide that. Now, here's something fun. I hear Relay is also known for its clever use of memes.
Yeah, they actually have a meme sensei on their team. His name is Arson.
A meme sensei? That's amazing.
I know, right? But it actually highlights something really important. Ideas, even complex ones like Bitcoin, can gain traction through things like humor.
And cultural relevance.
Yeah, totally. And memes are great for that. The expert we talked to even mentioned that presidents have been influenced by Bitcoin memes.
So they're not just for laughs. Memes can be a powerful tool to spread ideas.
Absolutely. And it shows that Relay is really thinking outside the box to reach a wider audience.
Okay, so we've talked about Relay's approach, but what about the bigger picture? What's going on with Bitcoin in Switzerland itself?
Well, Switzerland is actually becoming a real hotbed for Bitcoin activity.
Really? How so?
You're seeing growing interest from all sorts of investors.
Institutional investors.
Yeah.
Like banks.
Yeah, even banks. And there's even been talk about a potential Bitcoin reserve for the country.
Hold on, a Bitcoin reserve. Can you tell me more about that?
Sure. There's this group called Bitcoin Initiative Switzerland. And they're advocating for a change to the Swiss constitution.
To allow the country to hold Bitcoin.
Yeah, as a reserve asset, just like they hold gold. It's a huge step,
That could really change how Bitcoin is viewed globally.
especially in Europe. So it's definitely something to watch.
Definitely. So how's the rest of Europe doing when it comes to Bitcoin? Are they as gung-ho as Switzerland seems to be?
Well, it's a bit more mixed, to be honest. There's kind of a political divide.
How so?
You see more skepticism from the left and more support from the right.
Oh, interesting. So there's a political element to this whole thing.
Yeah, definitely. You know, the expert actually mentioned encountering representatives from UAE sovereign wealth funds who are looking into Bitcoin.
Really? So even sovereign wealth funds are getting interested.
Yeah, it seems like a global trend is emerging. But even with that, the expert still believes that there's a silent majority of Bitcoin supporters in Europe.
A silent majority? What do you mean?
They think there are a lot of people out there who support Bitcoin, but they're just not that vocal about it yet.
So what are they waiting for?
It's hard to say. It could be clearer regulations, or maybe they're waiting for the market to stabilize a bit more.
That makes sense. So even though Switzerland seems to be leading the charge, there's still a long way to go before Bitcoin becomes truly mainstream in Europe.
I think that's right.
And that brings us to the concept of hyperbitcoinization, which I know is something a lot of our listeners are curious about.
Yeah, it's a big topic.
What would that even look like in a place like Europe? And how would it affect everyday people?
The expert had a really fascinating take on this. They don't actually see hyperbitcoinization as this single event.
Like a sudden shift.
Yeah, they see it more as a process.
Okay, so how would that process play out?
Well, they said Bitcoin could become a global reserve currency,
Wow.
or we could see lots of local currencies backed by Bitcoin.
Or even stable coins built on top of Bitcoin.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not necessarily that everything just switches over to Bitcoin overnight.
It's more like Bitcoin could play all sorts of roles in a future financial system.
That's right.
So maybe hyper-Bitcoinization is more about evolution than revolution.
Exactly.
Okay, that's really interesting food for thought. But let's talk about a concern that some people have. What if hyper-Bitcoinization leads to Bitcoin becoming concentrated in the hands of just a few wealthy individuals?
It's a valid concern, for sure. But the expert actually had a really interesting response to that. They said, and I quote, "Every billionaire has a selling price."
Wow.
So their point was, even if some wealthy people acquire a lot of Bitcoin initially, market forces will eventually lead to a more even distribution.
Ah, I see. So it's not a static situation. The balance of power could shift as Bitcoin becomes more integrated into the economy.
Right.
And that actually brings us to the potential impact on developing economies. The experts specifically mentioned countries like Bangladesh.
Which have struggled with unstable financial systems.
They believe that a stable, decentralized currency like Bitcoin could be hugely beneficial in those situations.
It's a powerful argument for how Bitcoin could improve financial inclusion and give more power to people around the world.
So with all this potential and all these different scenarios for the future, what's the experts' overall outlook on Bitcoin?
They're very optimistic. They believe that Bitcoin's adoption is pretty much inevitable at this point.
So they see a positive future for Bitcoin.
Yeah, and they believe it has the potential to create positive change, especially for people who haven't had access to traditional financial systems.
That's inspiring. So it sounds like there's a lot to be excited about when it comes to Bitcoin.
Absolutely.
But before we move on to the next part of our deep dive, I have one more question about this expert's journey. You mentioned that they had this kind of aha moment when they realized Bitcoin's true potential. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. After they used Bitcoin for that plane ticket, they actually kind of forgot about it for a few years. It wasn't until they needed to send money to a friend in South Africa that they really rediscovered Bitcoin.
What was the situation with their friend?
Their friend was facing banking restrictions because of protests that were happening at the time, and traditional financial systems were basically failing them.
So Bitcoin was a lifeline.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that experience really opened the experts' eyes to how Bitcoin can function outside of these traditional systems.
Especially during times of instability.
Right. And that's when they really started to dive deep into Bitcoin.
I could see how that would be a turning point.
It was. And it sparked their interest in Bitcoin's technology and its whole philosophy.
It's amazing how real-world needs can drive innovation.
It's a great example of that.
Yeah.
It shows that Bitcoin isn't just some abstract idea. It's something that can solve real problems.
I think that's something our listeners can really connect with.
Yeah. It shows how Bitcoin can be a valuable tool for anyone who wants more financial freedom and control.
Well said. And we'll be right back after a short break to explore that idea even further.
We'll talk about Relay's approach to security.
And how they're empowering users to take control of their own financial future.
Stay tuned.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about the potential of Bitcoin to give people more control over their money.
And even change the whole financial system.
Right. And now I think it's a good time to talk about how Relay actually handles security. Because, one thing that might surprise some people is that they don't actually hold your Bitcoin for you.
Yeah, that's right.
So this idea of self-custody, I think that might be a bit daunting for some listeners.
Especially those who are new to Bitcoin.
So let's break it down a little bit.
Yeah.
What exactly does Relay's self-custody model mean for users?
Well, their whole model is built around this idea of putting you in control of your own Bitcoin.
So they're not like a traditional bank where you deposit your money and they hold it for you.
Exactly. They really believe that you should have the ultimate responsibility for your assets.
So it's kind of like having a safe in your own home.
Right. Instead of relying on a bank vault.
So instead of Relay storing your Bitcoin, they guide you on how to store it safely yourself.
Yeah, exactly. They provide the tools and the knowledge you need to manage your Bitcoin securely.
I imagine that's a big shift for a lot of people. Most people are used to just handing their money over to a bank and not really thinking about it too much.
It is different, but it's also really empowering.
So what kind of tools and knowledge does Relay provide?
They offer a lot of resources on best practices,
Like,
how to use a hardware wallet to store your Bitcoin offline. And they really emphasize the importance of protecting your seed phrase.
okay, and just to remind our listeners, the seed phrase is like a master key to your Bitcoin.
Right. If you lose your seed phrase, you lose access to your Bitcoin. So it's super important to keep it safe.
Okay, so it sounds like Relay is kind of like a guide. They give you the map and the compass, but you're the one navigating your own journey.
That's a great analogy.
Mm-hmm.
And, this approach really aligns with what we've been talking about.
About listeners wanting to learn more about Bitcoin and have more control over their finances.
Yeah, exactly. Relay is really trying to meet those needs.
Okay, so that's self-custody. Now, can we talk about the practical side of things? Like, how does someone actually use Relay?
Well, for individuals, it's pretty straightforward. If you live in Switzerland or Italy, you can just download the app.
Create an account.
Yep. And then you have to go through a verification process.
For security reasons.
Right. And once you're verified, you can start buying Bitcoin directly through the app.
So Relay acts as a kind of on-ramp to Bitcoin for people who maybe don't want to deal with the complexities of a traditional exchange.
Exactly. They've really streamlined the process to make it as easy as possible.
And they even have an auto-invest feature, right?
Yeah, so you can set it up to buy a certain amount of Bitcoin on a regular schedule.
That's cool. So it makes it easy to kind of dollar cost average your way into Bitcoin. But even though Relay doesn't actually hold your Bitcoin, they still take security seriously, right?
Absolutely. Security is a top priority for them. They only hold your fiat currency for the short time it takes to convert it to Bitcoin.
So they're minimizing the amount of time that your fiat currency is actually in their system.
Right. And as soon as the conversion is done, they send the Bitcoin directly to your self-custodied wallet, which you control.
So this approach directly addresses the concerns that a lot of people have about security, especially when you see stories about these big exchanges getting hacked.
Yeah. Those hacks can be really scary. But with Relay, you don't have to worry about that because they're not holding your funds.
So for people who value security and control, that's a big deal.
Definitely.
Okay, so we've talked about how Relay works for individuals, but what about businesses? Is the process similar for them?
The fundamentals are the same. But, businesses often work with larger amounts of Bitcoin.
Right.
So Relay has dedicated account managers who can work with them.
To make sure the process is smooth.
Yeah. And they also have something called an OTC desk.
OTC, meaning?
Over the counter. It's for facilitating larger transactions.
So they really cater to both individuals and businesses. With this Bitcoin-only approach, do you think there's any chance that they might expand in the future?
It's like offer other cryptocurrencies.
Yeah?
From what the expert said, I think it's highly unlikely.
Yeah.
They seem very committed to this niche.
They're really laser-focused on Bitcoin.
Exactly. They're kind of like a gold broker. They specialize in one high-value asset.
And they're really trying to maximize the whole Bitcoin experience for their users, from buying and selling to even exploring new technologies.
Like the Lightning Network, which we talked about earlier.
Right. And that focus really goes hand in hand with what we were discussing before.
About their belief in Bitcoin's long-term potential.
Yeah, they really see Bitcoin as the foundation, not just another cryptocurrency in a crowded market. Okay, so speaking of innovation, we mentioned the Lightning Network earlier. Can you explain what that is for listeners who might not be familiar with it?
Sure. Think of it like a superhighway built on top of the main Bitcoin blockchain.
Okay.
It basically makes Bitcoin transactions a lot faster and cheaper.
So is that what makes it possible to use Bitcoin for everyday purchases?
Yeah, like buying coffee or groceries, things like that.
So it solves one of the big problems that people have always brought up about Bitcoin.
Right. that it can be slow and expensive for small transactions.
Okay, so the Lightning Network basically makes Bitcoin more practical for everyday use.
Exactly.
That's pretty cool. And it shows that Relay is on the cutting edge. They're not just sitting still. They're always looking for ways to make Bitcoin better.
Yeah, they're trying to push the boundaries.
Now, I want to shift gears for a minute and talk about this idea of hyper-Bitcoinization again, because
Hmm.
I think it's something that a lot of people have a hard time wrapping their heads around.
It's definitely a mind-bending concept.
What's your gut reaction when you hear that term?
Well, for me, it kind of evokes this sense of the unknown. Like, what will the world look like if Bitcoin really does become the dominant form of money?
Yeah, it's kind of scary and exciting at the same time. But, as we were talking about earlier, maybe we need to rethink what hyper-Bitcoinization might actually look like. The expert we talked to said it might not be this single sudden event,
Right. It could be a more gradual process.
with Bitcoin playing different roles in different situations.
Exactly.
Like we might see Bitcoin adopted as a global reserve currency.
Or it could be backing various local currencies.
Or maybe we'll see a lot of stable coins built on the Bitcoin network.
Yeah, like a bridge between traditional finance and the crypto world.
So maybe instead of one currency to rule them all, we end up with a more diverse financial system.
With Bitcoin as the underlying foundation.
That's a really interesting thought. And it kind of challenges the assumption that hyper-Bitcoinization would be this disruptive, chaotic event.
Yeah, maybe it's more of an organic evolution towards a more decentralized system.
I like that. Okay, so even though hyper-Bitcoinization can seem like a really big, scary change, maybe it's more nuanced and adaptable than we think.
Definitely worth thinking about.
Absolutely. But for now, let's address another concern that I know a lot of people have about Bitcoin. What about the possibility that it could become controlled by a small group of wealthy people or institutions? Doesn't that kind of go against the whole idea of decentralization?
It's a valid concern.
Uh.
And it's something that a lot of people who believe in decentralization worry about.
So how do we address that concern?
Well, remember what the expert said earlier. Every billionaire has a selling price.
Right. I loved that quote.
So their point is that even if some people or institutions acquire a lot of Bitcoin in the beginning, the market will eventually balance things out. As Bitcoin becomes more widely adopted, we can expect to see a more even distribution of wealth.
So it's not like the power dynamics are set in stone. Things could change as Bitcoin evolves.
Yeah.
And this brings us back to what we were discussing earlier about Bitcoin's potential to empower individuals and communities, especially in developing countries where access to traditional banking is limited.
Yeah, that's one of the most exciting aspects of Bitcoin, in my opinion.
It has the potential to level the playing field and provide financial access to people who have been excluded from the traditional system.
Exactly.
It's definitely a vision that resonates with a lot of people.
For sure.
But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to circle back to something the experts said about their own journey with Bitcoin. Remember that aha moment they had?
When they realized Bitcoin could operate outside of traditional systems.
Yeah. I thought that was such a powerful example of how real-world needs can drive innovation.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that Bitcoin isn't just some abstract concept. It's a tool that can solve real problems for real people.
And for someone like you, who is looking for ways to take control of their own financial future, that's a message worth paying attention to.
Definitely. And it's a message that Relai seems to embrace fully.
Okay, well, we'll dive deeper into Relay's approach and the big picture implications of Bitcoin in the next part of our deep dive.
Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive on Bitcoin in Europe. We've been talking about Relay and their approach to Bitcoin. But, it's interesting.
What's that?
Relay's Bitcoin-only approach is actually part of a much bigger trend.
In Switzerland.
Yeah. The whole country seems to be becoming a hub for Bitcoin innovation.
It's true. Switzerland has always been a leader in finance. So it kind of makes sense they're embracing Bitcoin.
And we talked about that idea of Switzerland potentially setting up a Bitcoin reserve.
Right, which could have a huge impact globally.
And the group behind it, Bitcoin Initiative Switzerland, they're pushing for that to happen by 2030. That might seem like a ways off.
It does.
But just the fact that they're serious about it shows how attitudes are changing.
Definitely. And it's not just Switzerland. We talked about how there's this political divide in Europe when it comes to Bitcoin.
Yeah, with more skepticism on the left and more support on the right.
But the expert we spoke to, they think there's a big silent majority out there.
You mean people who support Bitcoin but aren't really vocal about it?
Exactly. And they think those people are all across the political spectrum.
That's an interesting idea. Is there any evidence to support that?
Well, they said they've personally encountered a lot of quiet interest in Bitcoin from people who aren't necessarily shouting it from the rooftops.
They see it as more of an undercurrent.
Yeah, like a groundswell of support that's building.
Okay, but what about the risk of banks trying to, like, take over Bitcoin?
Ah, the co-opting concern.
Yeah. Is there a chance they'll just turn Bitcoin into another product they control?
It's a valid concern, for sure. A lot of Bitcoin people worry about that. But it's important to remember how Bitcoin works.
Decentralized.
Right. No single entity, not even a big bank, can control it.
So even if banks start offering Bitcoin services, they can't really change the fundamental nature of Bitcoin.
Exactly. And, banks getting involved could actually be a good thing in some ways.
Really? How so?
It could expose more people to Bitcoin and maybe make it seem more legitimate to those who are still unsure about it.
So it could speed up adoption?
Potentially, yeah. But it's definitely a balancing act.
Because we want more people to use Bitcoin,
Right.
but we don't want to lose those core values that make it so unique.
It's tricky. And that's why it's so important for the Bitcoin community to keep pushing for the right kind of regulations. Regulations that protect decentralization.
Okay, so finding that balance is key. But let's move on to something a little more fun. We've talked about how Relay uses memes in their marketing.
Oh yeah, their meme game is strong.
What makes their approach so effective, do you think?
Well, for one, they don't take themselves too seriously. They're not afraid to be playful and use humor.
So they're making Bitcoin less intimidating.
Yeah, exactly. They're breaking down barriers and making it more relatable.
But they're also strategic about it, right?
Oh yeah, they don't just use any random meme. They pick memes that are relevant to Bitcoin and that can communicate their message effectively.
So it's not just about being funny, it's about using memes to educate and persuade.
Exactly. And they've actually seen some pretty interesting results. Like, they even think some of their memes have influenced politicians.
So memes can actually have real-world impact.
Apparently so.
Now let's talk about something that's really important to Relay.
Self-custody.
Right. They're big on users having full control over their own Bitcoin.
Which makes sense given their whole philosophy.
But for a newcomer, that whole idea of managing your own keys and wallets, it can be a bit overwhelming.
Definitely.
So how does Relay help people get over that hump?
Well, they've really made education a core part of what they do.
Like what kind of resources do they offer?
They've got tutorials right in the app. They also have email courses. And they even have a YouTube channel with educational videos.
Wow, so they're not just saying, here's your Bitcoin, good luck.
Not at all. They're walking you through it. They also have a great customer support team if you need help.
So they're providing that safety net for people who are new to this.
Yeah, for sure. They want people to feel comfortable and confident in managing their own Bitcoin.
Okay, but why is Relay so insistent on self-custody? Why not just offer a custodial service like a lot of other exchanges do?
I think it really boils down to their belief in empowering users. They want you to have the ultimate control over your Bitcoin.
Because when you hold your own keys, you're not relying on a third party.
Right. You don't have to worry about an exchange getting hacked or going bankrupt.
It's about giving you the highest level of security and control.
Exactly.
Now, I want to touch on something that the expert brought up that I think is really fascinating. They talked about Bitcoin potentially leading to a separation of money and state.
Wow. Yeah. Like a world where governments don't control money anymore.
It's a pretty radical idea. What do you think about that?
Honestly, it's a tough one. I can see both sides.
Yeah.
It'd be great to have a financial system that's free from government meddling. But at the same time, it's kind of hard to imagine what a world without central banks would even look like.
It's definitely a complex issue with no easy answers, but it's something we should be talking about, especially as Bitcoin becomes more mainstream.
Absolutely. And it's great that Relay is engaging in these kinds of conversations through their educational efforts and their involvement in the Bitcoin community.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've talked about Relay, their approach to Bitcoin, the potential for a Bitcoin reserve in Switzerland, the power of memes, and even the possibility of separating money and state.
Phew, that's a lot.
But it's just the beginning. You know, for anyone listening, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep exploring the world of Bitcoin.
The future is being shaped right now.
And each of us has a role to play in that. So until next time, keep diving deep.